Let's go and create a serverless API to support a contact page like this one. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever it is that I find you. Creating an API to send an email sounds like a pretty mundane task that shouldn't be that difficult, right? Well, it turns out that doing this with a serverless API such as Azure Functions, and when you add into the mix the new C# isolated mode, this presents a few interesting challenges. If you don't know what I mean by C# isolated mode, I've got another video that goes through and explains why we should be using that. And if you're new here, then you should know that this is part of a larger project to create a fully functional Jamstack website. And this API that we're going to create is to support our contact page. And you might want to stick around to the end of this, as there are some interesting gotchas around making this work in our production environment. So let's jump in. So here we are in Visual Studio Code, and the first thing I'm going to do is come over to the settings just in here, and this is just to get prettier and the formatting working. So this is an optional step, but I like to have it, so we'll copy that in there so that the C# files get formatted on save, essentially, is what we're doing. And with that done, what we're going to do is create a class called HTTP response extensions, and it's going to be a C# class. So let's create a public static class HTTP response extensions. And we can see that pretty is working because that's reformatting. And there's a couple of things that we want to do. So I'm going to paste in some code so you don't have to watch me type it. And we've got a formalized response method that is extending the HTTP response data, which is this new response type object. And basically all we're doing is we're dealing with the adding of the content type header in here. So we're just adding that, extracting that away. And we're also passing in a payload, and we write the payload into that HTTP response. Let's go and create something a little bit more useful to our API. So we'll simulate the kind of thing that we have with our in-process APIs today. Essentially, we'll create an OK response that extends off of the HTTP request, and we'll allow it to pass in a payload or not. And that is basically going to create the response, set the status code on the response, and then call the formalized method that we've just created to add in the content type header and the right string. So it nicely extracts away all of that kind of transport specific behavior, such that we can then come back over here, and instead of doing all of that, we can do request dot OK response, and then we can get rid of that and that, and in fact we can get rid of the response object in its entirety and really cut this down to 2 lines of code so that we can see exactly what's going on now in terms of business logic with our function. We've extracted that away, so I think that's a lot cleaner, and I'm pretty sure Microsoft will tidy this up such that they will get to this point. But for now, we've got to live with this headache of kind of creating our own extension methods to do this for us. But this is obviously only a demo HTTP API, so it's not really much use to us. So let's go and actually start creating our real API. So let's come back over here and let's create another separate C# file where we're actually going to create our API. And so we want, again, our public class in here. And I'm going to copy the boilerplate stuff in. So we inject in a logger that's a logger for our API functions class. Let's go and deal with those so that we get the usings. And that's a good start for us. Then we can paste in the beginnings of our API function API. So we're going to have a function called send email message, and it's complaining at the moment because I'm not returning anything, but that's fine. So this is going to be a function called send email message, and it's only going to take a post, whereas the example one takes a post and a get. For now, we're going to set the authorization to anonymous, so we're going to allow everyone through to call this API. This is how we can get our environment variables that are passed into our function. So basically, this is getting the environment, Azure Functions environment, and it's checking if it's equal to development. And so if that equals development, then we basically say, yes, we are running in our development environment. Otherwise, we're not running in our development environment. This Azure Functions environment variable being set to development, we have little to no control over at all. It's created by the Azure SDK tools and set to development automatically when you're running inside Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. In a production environment, it's not set to development, so that's why we can set this to indicate whether or not we're running locally in development or not. And whether this is useful to us yet, I'm not entirely sure. We'll come back to that, but it's a kind of nice to have, just so that we can potentially do something different if we're running locally. So we can perhaps turn off some of the features that we only want to have running locally in our API, as opposed to in our production environment. So let's carry on. So what we're going to do is just extend those extensions again with another response type, so a server error response, which is basically going to return us an HTTP 500, and the payload again can be passed into this. So we'll extend that back over in our function again. We will get an environment variable called SMTP server to get hold of the server, and we'll go and set that in our local settings. So we can just add in SMTP server in there and set that to localhost for now. And this is fairly typical for Azure Functions, is you set the settings locally. These are only used locally. If you're going to use this inside Azure and run up your production one, you need to make sure that you've added these into your function API as settings and set them accordingly as you need in that environment. So this file is only used locally. It's never deployed up into Azure. So let's go back, and now that we've got that, we can go and add some validation. Obviously, we don't just want to get the SMTP server. We want to make sure that it's set to a valid value, and so we can say if it's not set to a valid value, then we're going to use the logger, log out the error message to tell us what the problem is, that it's not been set, and we're going to use that new error response type, and that's what we're going to return back to our calling client to say that essentially this is indicating that this API has been misconfigured and is missing some essential settings. So I'm going to go ahead now and add in some more settings that we actually need to call an SMTP server. So I'm going to fast forward the video to where I've added all of those in. If you're finding any of this useful as we're going through any of this code, then please feel free to drop me a like or drop me a comment if you've got some alternative suggestions on how we can do some of this stuff. That'll be useful just to start a discussion around some of this to see if we've got better ways of doing things so that we can all learn. So that's all done. I've added in the extra environment variables into our settings file. So we've got port, and whether it's SSL, some username, password, and the email that it's coming from, and where we're going to send the email to. And over in the API, we're retrieving all of those settings. And the only difference is for the SSL, we actually do some extra work to get that into a Boolean. So that's the try parse down here. Other than that, all the settings are just checking and returning an error if they're missing, to indicate that the API has been misconfigured or it's missing some essential configuration. So that will help us when we get to Azure to indicate if we've missed a setting somewhere. So that's all our settings done. We can now start looking at the actual content that's coming in. So let's go and add yet another extension. This is going to return us a 400 to indicate a bad request. So this is where we can use this to validate some of the data that's coming in. If we go and add a string where we're going to hold the message body, then out of the headers we can get the content type header, and if the content type is empty or doesn't contain JSON, as we're expecting JSON to be passed into this API, then that's an error for us. So at that point we can also do something similar to what we've done above and create an error message to say that the content type that you've passed in is not allowed, and we'll return that bad request response. So we'll return an HTTP 400 in this case if we hit this error. So now we're mandating that we can only accept JSON into this API, and let's get the request body, read it all into a string, and with that we can then go and deserialize that into a JSON object, and we need to bring in the Newtonsoft JSON library to do that. So over in our project, let's add in the Newtonsoft JSON package, and then we can add a using for that. So that gets our request body into a JSON object that we can use. We need to go and add some validation. So let's add that in. So if data comes back as null, we return a bad request, and we also need to check for the elements being present in the payload. So we check for data name being there, and if it's not, it will be null. So we can return a bad request again saying that name has to be there, email has to be there, inquiry has to be there. And as well as that, what we want is for name, email and inquiry to all be objects. So we check the actual type on those and make sure that it is an object, and if not, we return again a bad request saying that the payload is incorrectly formed. We can then go and add values to go and actually get the data out of those, and we are going to set a flag if any of these are in error. We're going to add in another extension, response type of an unprocessable entity. So this returns an HTTP 422. So checking each one in turn, we'll check if name is null or empty. We'll return an error in the errors object against name to say what the problem is, and its name is required because it's a mandatory value. So we're using the request payload to populate with errors against individual field at this point. So slightly different to what we've done above. So we can populate those. So let's do the same for email and inquiry. And in addition to email, we also want to have a regular expression so that we can validate that email field and make sure that it's of a valid email format. And given that, we can then go and use that error response type at this point to return the unprocessable entity response if we've got any errors. So now we can have a look at how we actually call our SMTP server or our email server, and we can use the standard C# SMTP client to do this. So as we've done historically in the past, all of these classes are available to us inside Azure Functions. So we can create a new SMTP client based on the SMTP server variable that we've passed in, and we can use all those other properties that we've got above. so we can get the port and specify that. Any credentials we can specify using a network credential and pass those into that, and whether or not it's an SSL connection that we need or not. So this enables us to connect to a variety of different types of SMTP server with our API, using credentials if we need them and SSL if we need that as well. So as our email body is going to be an HTML body that we're going to send, not just text, we're going to do just some quick tidy up on the actual inquiry object itself, and we'll replace any new lines that are in that message that's come in into HTML breaks. That's just so that this works with a proper HTML formatted message. We'll then create our new mail message, and we need to specify where the message is coming from, so that we can get from our properties again. And the subject, we can hard code that to say that this is coming from our website. Then the actual message body itself, so the body is a string literal, and you can see here that we have to do a lot of work to escape out all of the quotes to make it work, and double brackets and all of that sort of stuff. Eventually, when we get to C#11, we can use raw string literals, which is a new feature that's coming. And if you want to have a look at what that looks like, there's a card popping up where you can go and have a look at that and see what that's all about. But for now, we have to live with all this extra escaping. So the body is basically just an HTML document. It's got some styling in there, some font sizes, etc., etc. And when we come down, you can see that we are injecting our values from our C# code into the various points of the HTML email. So that gives us the message body, and we just need to set final flag on the actual mail message to indicate that the body is HTML. So now we can add in the extra properties that we need on the mail message. So we add where it's going to go, the email that it's routing to. We can also add in to the reply to list the email that's been specified by the end user. So this is so that in your email client, if you respond to the email and you reply to it, it will get sent back to this email here. And finally, last but not least, we can actually send the email. We've got there in the end. And the last thing that we have to do is actually say that if we get this far in the code and we've sent our email, we can send back an OK response with an empty payload. In this case, there's nothing that we actually want to send back. The OK response is an HTTP 200, so any calling client can check for an HTTP 200. We could send back a no content response, I suppose, if we're being HTTP semantically correct, but a 200 will suffice for this. And with all of that done, we can go and run this up. So we can build it and run it, and we get the URL to our function here, so we can copy that. And with that, we can go over to the Thunder client that I've got installed. We can paste that in there, send in a post response, request rather, and we can see straight away we get a 400 back saying the content header is missing. So if I go and look at the actual response payload, it's telling me the content type is missing. So we can go and add in content type, and we can give it just an arbitrary value for now, just to prove that, and we get instantly back that test is not allowed. So let's go and change that to our application JSON that we would expect. We now get that we're missing a payload. So let's just shrink this down a little bit more and give ourselves a little bit of room and go and create a JSON payload. So if for now I just put in a name property, I now get a bad request because email address is required. So let's go and prove that validation works. And let's also add inquiry as well while we're here. So now if I send that in, I now get the payload is incorrectly formed because these are expected to be objects with a property of value. And let's just give ourselves a name. So all of these need to be actual objects that are passed in. And send this in and see what we get. We're now getting our 422 unprocessable entity. So if we go and look at what's come back, it sent us back the incoming payload again. So we get back my name and we get back email and an error against the email saying that that must be a valid email address. And just to prove inquiry is valid, so inquiry is valid down there. So let's go and change this to something that looks like an email address, and so that's giving us an error. So it's saying about specified string is not in the format required for an email address. So let's just go and check our settings over here. So no reply, so that should be .co.uk. That should be smartman@gmail, and likewise the 2 is also not a valid 2 email address. So let's save that and run that up again and send in another request, and it's now given me a 200. So I've got a program on here called Papercut. So let's go and have a look in Papercut. And we can see there that from my no reply email address, it's been sent to the email address I sent it to. And the body is exactly as my HTML body was specified. So it's got the contact name, the email address to reply to, and the actual inquiry. So that's good. So there's a couple of extra things that we can add in to make this a little bit more useful. I'm just going to add in a method that gets me the base URL. So this is useful if you've got an email API that's being called from multiple websites potentially. So we can use the referrer header, and we can strip out the part of the URL that tells us the actual caller that's calling this. With that function that gets us that from the actual request headers, we can go back up to, where do we want to put this? I think we can put it here, somewhere, anywhere before we actually use it in the mail message is going to be useful. And the other useful thing that we might want to get out is the end user's remote IP address. So in case we're being spammed from somewhere or something like that, we can again get the X forwarded for header out of the request and put that into our mail message as well, so that we can see where the IP address that's calling our API. With both of those values, we can go and change the actual content down here. So after we've done the inquiry, we can paste in just that to add in those extra values that we're seeing there. So if we stop and restart again, and if we send that in, we get our 200, and Papercut is saying that we've had an email. So we can go and look at that email, and now we get the extra information. It's not going to be populated. We're not populated the referrer header. And also we can't get the user's IP address because we don't have an X forwarded for header, but we could go and add those into to simulate that if we wanted to in the headers in here, but we don't need to do that. That will work when we get to production. And speaking of production, let's, now that we've got this working in a satisfactory manner locally, let's go and look at how we can use this in a production environment. What we need to do for that is come back over to our settings, and we need to change these to what we would use in our production environment. Now for this, I'm going to use Gmail. So, and the port for Gmail is 587, and it does use SSL. The username is going to be my email address, and the password I'm going to put in off screen. If we now go and run this and try and send this in, we'll see what we get. So we've got an exception that's come back. So let's go and have a look at that. The SMTP server requires a secure connection or the client was not authenticated. Server response was authentication required. So the reason for this is not immediately obvious, but if you do some Googling, you'll find that what you need to do is set up an application password for your actual application. So to do that, you need to go to your Gmail account and go to manage your Google account and go to the security tab and come down to signing in, and you need to enable two-step verification for starters. So let's go and do that. So I've just had that text message, so let's go and enter that. Okay, and then we get to here. So yes, we can turn on two-step verification. We should now find that we've got two-step verification turned on now, and we've got this app passwords that's popped up. So let's go and create an app password, and we can just do custom, and we can do a name for it. We can generate that, and that's the password it gives us. So let's copy that, and you're never going to see that again, so make sure you hang on to that somewhere in some password vault or something, just so you don't lose it. So let's go over to Visual Studio Code again, and it needs to go into this SMTP server password. So we can paste that in and save that. And let's run that again. And this time we get a 200. So if we go and look in our actual email inbox now, we can see we've got our email arrived from our website into our email system. So although I'm using Gmail, I'm actually sending it to my Gmail account, but you could send this to any email account but still use Gmail under the covers to do that. So that's working. So that's how we can actually do that in production, is if we use those settings and we set all those up inside Azure, then our Azure Function API will actually start sending emails out. And that is it for this video. We've learned how to create an Azure Function API in isolated mode in C# to send an email, and we've actually used that right through to sending in a production environment using our Gmail account to do that. So that's it, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.